All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. This crowd of people I don't recognize at all. No, it's good to see you all in person, right? We haven't been able to do that a lot lately. So welcome to BEV New York. Welcome to the Enology sessions. Very exciting. Yes. We're glad to have you all here and glad to be starting with one of our very esteemed colleagues here, who see if I can embarrass a lot before she comes. No, I won't do it too much. Nova Cadamatre is a master of wine, right? So pretty big deal. She is one of the 40 under 40 from Wine Enthusiast magazine. She helped create one of Wine Spectator's top 100 wines. She's done a lot of amazing things, despite having, humble beginnings at a small local institution on a hill somewhere in Ithaca. And having TAs like me, she still managed to thrive and succeed. And so, so even if you have hardship in your upbringing, you still might be able to achieve great things, which Nova has done. And so we're thrilled to have her here to talk about, this is basically your MW project, right? This is her major MW project, to which Nova put in lots and lots of hours and blood, sweat, and tears. And so she's excited to be able to actually tell you all about it, because we can have a public airing of the grievances and the data, right? So so Nova will be talking to us today about barrel sanitation, how to kill the stuff that needs killing in the winery without breaking the bank or the environment. I'm very thrilled and excited to hear this and to have Nova here. So thank you so much, Nova.
Thank you all. Yeah, Chris scared me there for a second because of all the people that I know in my life. Chris probably does have some embarrassing stories he could tell. Okay, so yes, as Chris mentioned, now it's not working. There it goes. Okay. As Chris mentioned, this was my research paper for my Master of Wine program. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Master of Wine certification, it's one of the top wine certifications in the world. There are currently less than 420 of us in the world right now. So for those who are counting, there are less people who have passed the Master of Wine than who have been to space. And that number is rapidly spreading because of the number of people now going to space. And so that's been kind of our metric, but we might need to find a new metric soon. So part of the program is there's 3 equally weighted parts of the Master Wine examination. So the first 2 sections are what's called the closed book examination, meaning I identified 36 wines blind from all over the world and wrote 5 theory papers on all sorts of different things around the world of wine. That part of the exam is 4 days long. The third part of the examination is a research paper, which you have to come up with a topic to research that has not been thoroughly explored before. And so for my research paper, I decided I was going to figure out how to clean a barrel definitively. Because for some reason, even though we've been using barrels for 200 plus years, nobody had ever really done the published research to actually figure out how to clean it, at least in a way that I felt was applicable to very easy to replicate situations in the winery. There were definitely studies that segmented barrels and put them into like little fragments of barrels in different conditions to see what the sanitation would be. There were people who did surveys of studies of wineries in the Okanagan to look at how they were cleaning barrels, and then looked at their subsequent spoilage rates to determine the most effective, just based off of purely coincidence of how things turned out. And just the list goes on and on of the research that's out there that was not directly applicable to saying this is what you need to do in a winery to clean your barrels. And given I was at Robert Mondavi Winery, I had over 40,000 barrels with red wine in them for 2 years. I really wanted to make sure I knew that when I was putting wine in a barrel that was new and clean and fresh, that I was not going to screw it up over the 2 years it was going to be in the barrel. So this was a really important topic for me. So quick background on, and my apologies to the folks on WebEx. I do tend to wander. I'm going to try to resist my wandering urges today, so that you can still hear and see me during the point of the presentation. But barrel use dates back to the 6th century. It's used for many styles of wine. The porosity of wood naturally can cause a lot of sanitation challenges. If you have 22 to 26 millimeter pieces of wood, the actually Brett cells can go almost halfway through that. And so you really have to figure out how to get deep in those cracks and crevices. Also, the cooperage themselves can really help or hinder you. There are definitely coopers that do barrel building better than others. If you've ever taken photos of the inside of a barrel, and I highly recommend you do, when you get them brand new, look for blistering, bubbling, cracking of the inside of the wood. Most people don't ever look inside their barrel definitively. And those places where there's blisters and cracking can really cause places to have more microbial issues than others. So you really want to have a nice, smooth, even toast on the inside of your barrels when you get them. And the coopers that don't have that, you want to be very suspicious of buying from those coopers in the future. And so Brettanomyces and Acetobacter are really the two key threats we're talking about when we're talking about barrel sanitation. So the first thing I wanted to do is determine what we know, what is established, and what do winemakers look for. And so I did a survey of winemakers in the Napa Valley because I had to limit my scope, and I was working in the valley at the time, and so that's where we went. So I did background research and historical context. So the first part of my paper, first two segments of my paper really are looking at this historical context. How do we start using barrels? And also what the research was to date. And then I did the survey of the wineries in Napa. So 91% of winemakers had seen some microbial issues over the course of their career, which is not terribly uncommon. Brettanomyces by far was the most common issue. Acetic acid bacteria was the second most common, lactic acids, mold, and then generally fermentable association microbes, so yeast and things like that. So pretty much everybody had seen some sort of issue, and I would be willing to bet the people who didn't see an issue had issues, maybe they just didn't know about them. So here is the results of the survey. So one of the things I asked is what sort of barrel sanitation techniques the wineries were using. So on this side of the graph is the number of sanitation techniques that each winery was using. So only 5% were using one treatment alone. 22% of wineries were using two treatments. 3% of wineries, or 44% of wineries were using three treatments. 20% of wineries were using 4 different treatments, and 9% of wineries were using 5 different treatments. What this tells us is nobody knew what was actually working. And so they were just kind of doing everything to make sure that worked. Oh, what's going on here? Did I hit something? Okay, so going back to the slide over here, the percent of winemakers using each technique. So I looked at basically 5 different techniques of sanitizing a barrel, and then also added a column for other. And you can see almost all the winemakers were using hot water. Some were using ozone, over 75% were using steam, some were burning sulfur. So but the challenge here is it didn't add up to 100%. So no single person was using only one technique. Everybody was using multiple techniques. So here's the key. Just because you are doing something doesn't mean it's doing what you think it's doing. And that was the challenge that we had run into in Valley, is that everybody had kind of figured out, okay, generally something in what I'm doing is working, but I don't know what, and I don't know what it's doing. So here's the perception from the winemakers of effectiveness. Now, this is not data on actual effectiveness. It's data on how it made the winemakers feel that was doing. So most people thought that hot water was not very effective. Yet on the previous slide, 90% of them were using hot water, which still doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Steam in the middle, people thought was pretty much effective. Ozone definitely was a second place on the effectiveness thoughts. Burning sulfur and citric and SO2 were kind of tied for, oh yeah, this seems like it's doing something. So here's the perception of environmental friendliness, because part of my research paper was not just how do you kill the stuff, but how do you do it in an environmentally friendly way and a financially viable way. And so not just were we looking at the effectiveness, but also what sort of environmental impacts your cleanliness was working with, and also does it pay off to be doing this. So here's the environmental friendliness. So obviously ozone, because it's got a really bad rap because the ozone layer has a really bad environmental connotation, even though it's not too bad for sanitation. Steam seemed to be the most environmentally friendly. Hot water Probably second place on that, citric and SO2, not very friendly at all. And here's the perceived expensiveness, because what I noticed about winemakers in the Napa Valley is their relative expensiveness is very different from everybody else's relative expensiveness. And that was very clear in the survey. So generally the perceived expensive is, you know, the burning and citric SO2, not very expensive, hot water, not very expensive. Steam is somewhat expensive, but still not bad. So if you had asked winemakers in different regions of California, and I did ask a few folks down in the Central Coast just for comparison's sake to see if this was a Napa effect of perceived expensiveness, and they were like, oh yeah, ozone and steam are really expensive. So there is a Napa bias here of how expensive things seem to be. So what is the reality? What is actually doing things? So here's our methodology. So we had 36 barrels from a single lot of microbially compromised wine. We separated those into 6 barrels in each treatment. Each barrel had confirmed Brettanomyces populations. Then the way the 6 barrel replicates were comprised is we tried to normalize the aggregate population within the 6 barrels. So they all had kind of different levels, but they all had something. Here were the 6 treatment groups, the control, steam, ozone, burning sulfur, citric and SO2 solution, hot water. And we all did a 30-second cold rinse to remove the wine sediment once the wines were removed prior to the trial. So that's important to know, because yes, that will have some impact on the microbial population, but because we did it to all barrels entirely, that should normalize that impact and not have an effect on the outcome. So here's the treatment detail for those of you who want the really what exactly did you do for each of these treatments. So I tried to be as precise as possible so that whoever, if you saw my research paper, you could replicate this in your own winery. Here's obviously the citric and SO2 solution is probably the most detailed and intensive of all the treatments, because it is a very specific weight and measure per barrel. And you're also leaving that soaking for 2 weeks. So that's the longest of the treatments. Everything else is a pretty fast turnaround. So this was trial day. And as you can see, this is our barrel warehouse in the south of Napa. It's called the Bedford Barrel Warehouse. So this warehouse alone was around 35,000 barrels. And so we were able to have many different lots to pick from. And so we picked this one lot because of its potential to get us the best data. We did a lot of sterilized water to do the sampling. So we sterilized water, put it in the barrel post the cold water rinse, turned them official same amount of times, then extracted the water to do the microbial sampling on. Then we did the treatment. More sterilized water went in after the treatment, turned it the same number of times. And so we tried to keep every piece of the experiment as controlled as possible to reduce the variables. So here's the before and after samples of a few of the treatments that I still had pictures for. So you can see the control. You've got, some darker red water coming out versus lighter red water. Ozone, darker red water versus the ozone, where you really see a lot of the breakdown of the color compounds. And then darker red water with steam versus a lighter pink water coming out on the other side. So you're definitely seeing a difference just in the cleanliness aspect of both of these. But you can definitely see like ozone and steam has a clear difference from control. So then we went into the analysis part. So the only way we were able to do DNA analysis, i.e. PCR analysis, was for Brettanomyces, because that's really the only primers that we had to do PCR with. So this is definitely going to be the most sensitive of the tests that we did. Everything else was done by traditional plating. So if you can see here, we had quite a load of Brett coming into the treatments, and most of the treatments did a pretty good job of dropping the Brett levels. But the two that did the best were definitely steam and ozone. And what you do see here is some cellular activity, but there's still kind of a question mark of whether this is recently dead cells, or if it's viable but non-culturable cells. And so what you're seeing in the Brett results by plating is you're seeing a lot of zero growth on the plating side with the different treatments, but because of where the PCR is, there is a good chance that a lot of the zero growth is caused by viable but non-culturable, which is still going to give you a problem in the winery, even if you can't find it. So here's the results by plating. Saccharomyces results by plating, which I also looked at, which, you know, pretty much everything did a pretty good job on Saccharomyces if you're going by plating. And then Acetobacter results by plating. And this gave me a severe concern now of what we're doing when we're burning sulfur. Every single one of the replicates of the burning sulfur barrels had an increase in Acetobacter that was quite significant. And so at this point, and this is what I was talking to Chris about earlier, it is something that I would be not considering as a viable sanitation option for barrels going forward, just based on this. But the more needs to be looked at, but it was a significant growth beyond what we saw in the control. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. So then now we had all these numbers and I had all this data and I had to figure out, okay, how do you develop a calculation? So I had to develop two different calculations for this, which made me feel a little bit like a beautiful mind getting up on a chalkboard and going, okay, how do I do this? So my apologies for the small font here. If you really want to get into the details of this, you're welcome to request a copy of my paper from the Institute of the Masters of Wine. They will give them out. But this is the developed an average effectiveness number calculation and then also a value calculation. So looking at the cost versus the effectiveness. So average effectiveness, so the lower the number, the more effective the treatment. And so steam and ozone showed the most favorable effectiveness. So obviously you see steam is 0.01 and ozone is 0.02. Really that's driven by that PCR number that you saw, which was so low. And there was a slight difference in the culturable or the yeast cells found, or sorry, Brett cells found in the PCR, but they were the lowest two of all of the treatments. Hot water, citric and SO2, you're seeing are pretty low, but burning sulfur, because of that increase in Acetobacter, saw quite an increase in the average effectiveness number. And so that's why I am very hesitant to recommend it as an accurate way of sanitizing barrels. Here are the environmental results. So as we were going through all these treatments, we were measuring exactly how much energy, how much water, how much gas was being used to do each of the treatments. And so this is the amount for steam, ozone, hot water, citric and SO2, and burning sulfur. And so you can see there's definitely differences in energy usage, particularly around steam and ozone. Hot water quite a bit. The citric and SO2 solution, I mean, really you're just dealing with water at that point. And then there's burning sulfur. So here is the total cost of treatment per year per barrel for the first 3 years. Now, these assumptions were based on 8,000 barrels being treated per year, and the capital purchases of the steam and ozone being normalized over the first 3 years. So, you know, obviously, if you purchase a steam unit or an ozone unit and you capitalize it all in 1 year, that's going to really skew your financial numbers. So I had to have some way to normalize it out. So it's based on 3 years and 8,000 barrels. So capital costs here, you know, you're spending about 35 cents a barrel for 8,000 barrels for steam. And then your total cost, once you put in all the environmental factors, is $6.71, ozone $7.89, hot water $2.22, citric and SO2 $1.75. Although one thing I didn't calculate in with the citric and SO2 is that two-week soak period that you have to have. So I mean your time turnaround there might be a little bit more challenging. And then the burning sulfur looked about $1.56 per barrel. So quantifying value. So now we have an effectiveness of each of the treatment and we have a value of each of the treatment. So this one was more straightforward. The value equals effectiveness times cost, basically. The lower the number, the more value one sees from the treatment based on its effectiveness. So your steam is the lowest of the numbers because it is the most effective and it's also the most environmentally friendly based on looking at all these different factors. Ozone, because it is still very effective, but is a little bit more costly from an environmental standpoint, is weighted 0.16. Hot water is a little bit higher, not because it's more expensive, but because it's not as effective. So this is kind of your bang for your buck type situation. Citric and SO2, again, higher than that, but very, very cheap. And then burning sulfur, again, because of the numbers of acetobacter we saw in that sample, that was much higher. So here's the, with burning sulfur, the average effectiveness to total cost per barrel. So this is the, law of diminishing returns. If you really want to kill everything, you've got to spend, $5-6 more than if you only want to kill most things. So this really comes down to the size of your winery and what makes sense for you from a business perspective. Now, I did do the analysis to determine, okay, what's the minimum number of barrels you need before the before this number down here for citric and SO2 or hot water equals the number for steam and ozone, because this is all based on 8,000 barrels, and I would be willing to bet most people in this room are well below that. The minimum number to make steam equal the citric and hot SO2 is 120 barrels. So if you're looking at, will a steam unit or will an ozone unit pay off for your size of winery? If you have 120, at least 120 barrels, then you are going to get more bang for your buck out of a steam or ozone unit than you will out of soaking citric and SO2. But if you are less than that, say you only have 10 barrels, then citric and SO2, while not as effective as steam, is going to be a better value for you from a effectiveness standpoint. So then, we still have this outlier of burning sulfur. So I decided to take that out and see what the effectiveness curve would look like. We got a little bit stronger on our R squared, but it wasn't like 95% confidence interval. So this is a really loose correlation, but it generally gives you the sense of, yes, the more you spend, the more effectiveness you get. But that last little bit to killing pretty much everything is a lot of money compared to killing most things. So back to our perceptions, and I'm not even sure where we are on time here. How are we doing here? Okay. All right. So back to our perceptions. So this is back to the survey. So of all the winemakers in Napa that's answered the survey, even though vast majority of them were using at least 3 treatments, steam was by far the most preferred. So that means that most people had an inkling that they knew what was working, even though they were still doing a bunch of other stuff in conjunction with it. The only group that was using 1 treatment was using steam. So that is it. The answer is steam. Just steam everything. And while I have a captive audience here, talking about winery sanitation, if you have fruit flies in your winery, you have acetobacter. Your winery is not clean. It is not normal to have fruit flies in your winery at harvest. That is a big pet peeve of mine around here. So steam works wonders for cleaning floors, walls, drains, all sorts of stuff. So you can really get a lot of use beyond just cleaning with barrels out of a steam unit. And I swear I did not have the steam guy come down and give you a steam thing, but he is here. Ozone, if you have an ozone machine, it is quite effective if you've already purchased it, although from a value standpoint, it's not quite the same value as steam is. But that's basically it. It's the whole 7,000 words summed up in one, just by a steam unit. So what questions do you have for me? Yes.
You're steaming the barrels, how frequently were you going back to check and see the population of anything in the barrel? Was it just one treatment?
Yeah. So the question is, how often were we going back and doing population counts in the steamed or in the treated barrels? And we actually did go back about 3 weeks after we did the initial round, and we did a second round just to see, kind of go, okay, is there anything growing at this point that we would have missed at the very early point? And there wasn't any appreciable change in the data. And so we felt, at least for the couple of weeks that we had in between the treatment and the end data, that we felt pretty confident that we could say that the initial values for the data would be holding that long. Now, obviously, if you steam them and you leave them to sit for 4 or 5 months, you're going to have some growth, I recommend steaming at emptying and steaming at prior to filling the next time again. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
No, it's all.
Do you have any opinions on citric versus tartaric for soaking?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I've always just used citric because it was cheaper than tartaric.
Which is no longer,
For the case.
Yeah.
So really you're after pH there, so it wouldn't really matter. And obviously that would change the calculations because tartaric is a much stronger acid than the citric is. But yeah, I mean, citric is what we were using for neutralizing things in the winery after, sterilizing tanks and stuff like that. So that was our standard cleaning acid. So yeah, this is all based on citric, but you can do the same thing with tartaric. Really, you're just looking for a very low pH to have maximum effectiveness of the free SO2 in the barrels. I don't think it would change the timeline you need to soak it though. So I think you're still looking at a 2-week soak. The positive thing about the citric and SO2 solution is you can reuse it if you keep, checking the pH and checking the SO2, and you just add more tartaric or citric or NSO2 to that to make sure your free stays constant. And you can move it around to different barrels doing that. So you can get a couple more uses out of it than what this shows here. Obviously, water is not our limiting factor here, but California water use is a big deal. So being able to reuse that solution is critical.
and with the sulfur and citric and sulfur that you were using, you weren't cleaning those barrels before, you were just using those methods.
It was a 30-second cold water rinse
Okay.
to get out most of the gunk.
Okay.
Was there cleaning done before? No, this was purely looking at how can we
Sanitation.
sanitize
Okay.
these? Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we wanted to have maximum population, without having a bunch of gunk in the barrel, to make sure we understood exactly what was doing what. Now, if you had cleaned them prior to doing sanitation, we might have seen even lower numbers than what we saw.
I had always been under the impression that ozone was rather unstable and would rather quickly go back to O2. So I'm curious, am I wrong about that? And what are the environmental impacts of ozone exactly?
So the ozone generation that you have with an ozone machine in a winery, you are correct. It will break down pretty quickly. But having a generation machine on site is how you clean with ozone. And so really from an environmental standpoint, you're looking at the electricity usage. That's the biggest difference between the steam and the ozone machine. The electricity usage is much, much higher on an ozone machine because you are having to generate the ozone. There are some safety concerns with both steam and ozone, really. Steam obviously being the burn factor. And if you don't pull the bung open, because the steam will pull a vacuum on the barrel, and if you don't pull the bung open in enough time, it will collapse the barrel. So you have to be careful about that. So there is some training that needs to happen there. From an ozone exposure perspective, it's not great to be right next to the machine all the time, but it's not going to be just like killing the atmosphere constantly. I think there's a big misunderstanding around that, but it is less environmentally friendly just from a utility perspective. Yeah.
Couple questions related to the SO2 citric acid blend. One is, were the barrels completely filled with the solution? And second, any comments on citric acid in the presence of Acetobacter? And if tartaric perhaps is a more stable alternative.
The barrels were completely full, so 59 gallons of water in each. Comments on the acid being more stable?
Production, in terms of VA production, in other words, with citric acid,
Right.
with Acetobacter.
I've seen, we can go back and look if we wanted to about the, oh, maybe it's not up here anymore. Oh, can we pull the slide up where we had the plating of the Acetobacter? me see if I can get back there. Hmm. Oh. Okay, so here's your Acetobacter results by plating. So it's definitely less than hot water and pretty even with steam and ozone. So, I mean, it is quite effective. And previous to me doing this experiment, like citric and SO2 was my go-to, especially if I had a really problem in a lot of barrels, and I would just, let them soak for a couple of weeks and then clean it out, and that usually cleaned them up. But this kind of gives you a sense of, like, in comparison, it's pretty good. It's not to the same level that steam and ozone are, but it's for a low-tech method of cleaning, it's actually really good. You can't, you can store it long-term in the barrels if you want to keep them soaked up, but you do have to really monitor the pH and the SO2 levels in it, because it can go downhill very quickly if you're not really keeping that up. You're welcome. Yes.
Should I toss it?
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Really liked it. For the microorganisms that are impacting the barrels the most, it seems like Acetobacter is the main concern, but are there other ones that would cause a quality decline in the wine long term? Other organisms?
Well, for Napa Cab, obviously Brett is definitely our biggest concern. And so my method of managing that was testing for PCR for Brett once a month or once every 6 weeks, somewhere in that zone. I was lucky because I had a PCR machine at the winery, and we could just keep it running, like, constantly. If you don't have that level of technology, it's really challenging to keep a handle on where your problems are. Everybody has problems. Everybody. If somebody tells you I don't have Brett in my winery, they just don't know where it is, because it's there. And that is the biggest quality problem with wines in barrel. Acetobacter is a lesser concern, still a concern, but a lesser concern, because if you keep your barrels accurately topped up, you're not allowing oxygen into those barrels to the extent that it will allow Acetobacter to get a real handle on it and grow. But Brett doesn't care about the oxygen very much, and so it'll sit there and not do anything and just look at you for a long time, and then suddenly it'll wake up one day and the humidity's right and it'll start growing. And so it's very interesting, because if you know where your populations are, then you can manage it and control them over a long period of time before it starts to be a quality issue. So our goal, when I was at Mondavi, was always the final blends needed to be less than 200 ppb of 4-ethyl glycol, and 4-ethyl phenol, and then less than 70 4-ethyl glycol. And that was the quality goal. We weren't ever going to be zero, but we wanted to be below detectable levels of those compounds. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, awesome. Let's see, not a question, but I'll pick up your paper from IMW. Great, awesome. There's a little slide. The Acetobacter population was so the Acetobacter population was actually higher with burning sulfur. So any ideas why? I have no idea why, but it made me scared enough to be like, I'm never burning sulfur ever again. And it was odd, because it wasn't just one of the 6 barrels. It was all 6 barrels showed an increase. And so that's where, and it was a greater increase than what we saw in the control, which also made me quite concerned. And if it had just been 1 barrel, I could have chalked it up, even 2 barrels, I could have chalked it up to, okay, that's just a weird anomaly, but all 6 of them had the same phenomenon. And so that made me very concerned about what burning sulfur was doing. And at the time, we had, 5,000 gallon oak tanks in the cellar, that burning sulfur was how we were managing them. And that made me very concerned about those tanks. So, we started using a lot of water to citric and SO2 soak those. And also we started playing around with, could you steam a 5,000 gallon tank made of wood, which you can, but it's quite tricky. Let's see, if storing barrels empty for more than a few weeks, what's the best practice? Empty closed, empty bung off, storage solution. Thank you. Yeah, so make sure your barrels are thoroughly dry and upside down with the bung facing down. I'm a big fan of those little, like, sample cups, like solo cup almost things, but not really, not the plastic ones, like the paper ones. It does generally keep bugs and mice out, but it doesn't pull a full seal on it. And that's my problem with the bungs is it puts a full seal, which then, you're not getting a lot of airflow with the cup, but you're not getting no airflow. Whereas the bung, that creates a seal and that becomes its own little environment to grow things. And so try to keep it as, open as you can without inviting varmint. But yeah, and again, steam it again before you fill it, just to make sure you've really taken care of anything that's grown over the course of the time it's in storage. I meant, how are barrels stored after cleaning and before filling? Are they empty for months at a time or with a filled stock solution? Again, at Mondavi, they're empty for months at a time, and we were using SO2 gas. But again, that's not very practical at a small scale. So I highly recommend steaming after you empty them. Make sure they're completely dry before you put them away, and store them bung hole down. If you're only using hot water for cleaning and sanitizing, how often are you repeating this process to maintain sanitation? If you're only using hot water, I highly recommend getting a different sanitation method. Citric and SO2 or tartaric and SO2, as we talked about, is cheap. It's easy. Everybody has what they need today in a winery to make that happen. So please start using that, because hot water should not really be considered appropriate sanitation. It's great for cleaning, but it won't sanitize a barrel. Great. Yes.
So for the steam cleaning treatment, we saw that the efficiency value was really high because it was really effective for getting rid of all those bacteria, even though the cost was rather high. Now, this wasn't tested, but based on your knowledge, do you suspect that maybe combining two methods, like the cheaper methods, for instance, hot water plus the citric solution, could reach similar levels of effectiveness and thus be maybe a good, like, high efficiency solution for, wineries that don't have a steam cleaner or ozone generator?
Yeah. As we saw on the Napa survey, like, multiple ways of cleaning it definitely make people feel more comfortable. Do they actually create a more of a effective cleaning than one of the other two methods alone? I can't speculate because I didn't test on that. But I mean, it comes down to your time and how much time do you have to sit there and do all of these processes. And if you've got 40,000 barrels, like, and you're cleaning 40,000 barrels, you break that down on a per day basis of how many barrels you have to clean per day. And you look at the labor rates and stuff like that, you have to be super, super efficient with how you're doing this. And so we were really looking for biggest bang for your buck from a time, from an energy, from everything perspective, like what's the best option going forward. Because we were like everybody else, we had an ozone generator, we had a steam generator, we used hot water. If it was really, really bad, we'd pull out the citric and SO2, although again, that's a really time intensive way of cleaning barrels. And it was just not practical for what we were doing. So really we were looking at, okay, for this size winery, what's the best option for us to be using and how is it going to be most effective? And that answer for us was steam.
Thank you. And then I just had one more question. So how were the barrels compromised? Like the various bacteria and yeasts, what was the condition of the barrels for the experiment?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's probably no secret that Mondavi for a long time was unfiltered. And, it was challenging from year to year, the different levels of microbial contamination we have. And once you have it in the winery, it's gone. You can't get rid of it ever again. It's just going to manage your population. And so that was our goal, was managing our populations and learning how to control it best we could. So yeah, it just exists in the atmosphere. And if you have a winery, you have it, I guarantee you.
Or as in the barrels for the experiment, were they inoculated with these?
No.
They were just like dirty barrels.
Yes.
Okay.
They weren't dirty barrels. They were wine barrels. We had barrels with wine in them with that level of Brett population.
I see.
Again, it's just understanding where your populations are and how do you best manage them. That is really the key.
Thank you. Because I've read some literature that has suggested that because of the porosity of wood,
that even steam has trouble penetrating
That's
Um,
true.
or Brett, especially like, and other spore forming
Yeah.
bacteria. So would you say that, if you just steam long enough that you can even, save one of these barrels or?
No, we saved all the barrels that are there. I think the key difference is that wine, unlike food production, you're not trying to have a completely sterile environment. And as much as I hate the chapter on Brett in what was the postmodern winemaking by Clark Smith, I really hate that chapter on Brett. Because he's like, just let it all go, it's fine, it'll all self-control, which I'm like, no, it won't. But it will always be there. You're not going for total eradication. That's not the point. You're going for control. And if you can control the populations you have so that you're not seeing a detriment in quality, then it doesn't really matter that you can't get all the way into the wood. What matters is that you're controlling the populations that you have, and I guarantee you have them. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have an online question. What's
Okay.
the optimum humidity for storage of empty or open barrels to play the balance of loose staves versus microbial growth?
Yeah, so our rule was around 55% humidity at 65 degrees. And that was what we kept our misters at, and that's what we kept the winery at and the barrel rooms at. And so that was both for barrel storage and for empty barrel storage. So that's kind of your optimum for keeping the fungal growth at bay, but also keeping the humidity in the room so the barrels don't dry significantly out. If you leave barrels open with no liquid in them for months, you're gonna see some separation between the staves, and and steam actually will help rehydrate that barrel before you fill it again. So that also saves a lot of time in like pumping water through the barrels, trying to rehydrate them slowly, because the steam allows the wood to expand more rapidly. What we did with the tanks is we had fans in the top of the tank to move that air through. Otherwise, we did get fungal growth in the tanks themselves. So the rest of the 9 months that we weren't harvesting and fermenting, that those tanks were empty, we just had these fans on timers moving the air around the rooms. But the barrels, yeah, we just left them in that kind of mix of humidity and temperature, and then steamed them on both sides going through. Yes.
In the steaming process,
Yes.
did anybody take the heads off, or do they just assemble the barrel?
No, you definitely don't want to purposely take the heads off. You can definitely accidentally take the heads off, and that compromises the head.
We do 3 a year,
Yeah,
take them apart,
okay,
steam them,
and put them back together.
and put them back together and sell them.
I know a lot of people I have taken heads off of barrels with that man right over there. We've done it together. But I don't like putting them back together and assuming that they will be watertight on the other side of it. I'm not that skilled of a cooper. I can take them apart, but I don't like putting them back together. But I don't recommend, if you're doing it for cleaning purposes, to take a barrel apart. I definitely recommend steaming them, but that will pull a vacuum on the barrel, and the stronger the original integrity of the barrel is, the more effective that vacuum will be. But again, you don't want to leave that vacuum on for too long. I think I had a 2-minute bung on the vacuum, and then we opened it after 2 minutes.
Is there a difference between using ozone gas versus ozone water on a barrel?
That's a good question. This was ozonated water that we were using. So I can't really speculate on the difference between, I would assume they would be similar, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, and there were definitely a few treatments, like one treatment that didn't make this experiment was a dry ice treatment. Another one was what happens if you recooper the barrel, you shave the inside and then retoast it. Like, I didn't look at that. Some things were just outside of practicality for most wineries. And so I just kind of assumed that those were not going to be as mainstream. So I can't speculate on those. Well, thank y'all very much. This is the first time I've ever publicly presented these results, so I'm excited. So this is, it's first time in 5 years.
Can I do some extension public things about just remembering the difference between like cleaning and sanitizing, right? These are all sanitizers, right? And so no sanitizer works particularly well if you haven't done good cleaning. And so one of the things with your treatment, your trial, where you were not really doing effective cleaning was showing like, what can happen, with a really effective sanitizer treatment is I think it shows that steam is effective, even cutting through that clutter. And some of those things like ozone, I think in particular, can be less effective at cutting through the dirtiness. So I just want to point that out. We did have a trial that Randy Warbo did with a student where they did clean the barrels a lot, or they completely clean the barrels and found some different results. But it's a different paradigm. I think it's a different protocol. Very dry barrels, they found burning sulfur discs worked really well, but they didn't look at bacteria. They looked at yeast. They drilled some cores and they also some samples, and they found it very effective against zygo and Brett. But I'd be interested to see how they would do against bacteria.
Yeah, and our burning sulfur was quite effective against yeast, but it was not effective at all against Acetobacter. So.
And they left the barrels dry after treatment. And so like 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, that's a good way to store, I think, a dry barrel, perhaps, but I'll have to investigate the bacteria. So. Any other questions? Should we thank our speaker one more time for presenting today?
Thank you very much.